Well, Representative Jayapal, what a pleasure to see you even in virtual form. Thanks for taking a few minutes to sit down by Zoom and talk. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Chairman Schiff, and thank you for everything you're doing. And it's just such a pleasure to be here with you, even if we're on the screen across from each other instead of physically, next to each other.
Well, I wanted to chat with you today about an effort you're leading in the House that I very strongly support, a paycheck guarantee proposal. We just finished getting back from Congress, voting for another $480 billion to replenish the small business fund, to help our hospitals, to augment testing and call for a national testing strategy, something that's been sorely missing. But many are experiencing great difficulties with the small business program. We saw large companies access the funds while a lot of small mom and pop businesses couldn't. I've felt, I think as you have, that we really need to go big. We also need to go simple and more equitable. And you have something that would do exactly that. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your support of this plan. It's essentially a Paycheck Guarantee Act. And you've been incredibly helpful in lifting this up and lifting up the idea that we need bold relief. We can't just trust our existing systems to deliver this relief because the scale of the crisis is so huge. So this has been gaining support from a lot of our folks in caucus, but also major economists, labor unions. The former chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, has spoken out for this. Joe Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist. So we're gaining traction, but the idea is simple, which is that we need to stop mass unemployment. The federal government under this act would provide a 3-month upfront grant that would cover wages, but also benefits for workers up to a salary cap of $100,000, so that employers who are suffering a revenue loss or shut down because of COVID-19 can continue to keep their employees on payroll. The grant would also allow a maintenance cost for businesses because we know that they've got fixed costs like rent and utilities, and they need to be able to pay those fixed costs in order to keep the business going. The money would flow straight from the Treasury to the business, because remember, every business files a tax return. So it would be very easy to calculate a lump sum payment and then use both Treasury and payroll companies to disperse the money. So we wouldn't need a network of banks that frankly have not been particularly good at providing money to small businesses, to the unbanked, to folks of color. This would be simple and it would be direct. It would be retroactive to March 1st, so that if a worker had been laid off or furloughed before the act is passed, we could bring them back onto the payroll. And it would also be scalable. So if a business has 70% of their revenue coming in, they would get 70% of the grant. I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is think of healthcare and the economy as deeply intertwined. Job number one is to beat the virus. To beat the virus, we need people to stay home. For people to stay home, they need to be able to get a paycheck so that they can put food on the table and pay their rent or their mortgage. And businesses need to know that they're going to have some support to continue after the crisis. And this act it does both. It's pro-business, it's pro-worker, it's pro-economy, and it allows us to respond to the needs of the health crisis that is before us. And so that's the concept of the act, and I'm just really thrilled to have this chance to lift it up with you.
Well, I think this is a terrific idea. And as we discussed some time ago, I first became acquainted with it talking to some friends in Europe about 2 months ago, when the pandemic really started taking a toll on the global economy, and learned that Britain and Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and other countries were using this guarantee, where their federal government was essentially helping to guarantee payroll. It struck me as a very simple, a very equitable, a very systematic vision that was as big as the problem that we face. And one thing that particularly appealed to me about it was that rather than have massive numbers of people laid off, and when we do recover, when we get past the health crisis, then have all these people go through the indignity of losing their work, all of the instability in their household, and then have to go job hunting all over again. Through this kind of a payroll guarantee, they would never lose their job. They would stay employed even if they weren't able to do their work. So it seemed simple, equitable, large enough for the problem. I particularly liked, Pramila, that it wouldn't allow the administration to pick its own winners and losers. This president has a history of trying to reward friends and punish enemies. But you also wouldn't have the banks picking their favorite customers. And we've seen that, sadly, a consequence of abuse in the small business program. But I tried to socialize this idea with some of the committees, but you have taken it to a completely different level with the introduction of this legislation, with the bring on board these world-renowned economists and really getting the leadership, I think, engaged with this idea. Now, there are different iterations in Europe. Some countries guaranteeing 70% of the payroll, others 80%. Tell us how you arrived at the numbers you did, both in terms of covering all the payroll and up to 100,000, and what impact that has on cost.
Yeah, absolutely. So, probably in Germany is the most established plan. They actually had it before the pandemic hit. Other countries have implemented it, and not just in Europe, by the way. Singapore, Malaysia, a number of other countries around the world have put this in place because they understand exactly what you've been saying, that mass unemployment is a policy choice. And there are very, very important reasons to not have unemployment and push people onto these other systems, but to keep workers and businesses tied to each other. So in terms of how we arrived at the number, Germany's number is around the equivalent of an $85,000 salary cap. I believe that if you take into account the expenses that American workers have to cover that in Germany or other parts of Europe are already covered by the federal government, whether it's childcare or healthcare, et cetera, 100,000 is about the equivalent of what Germany does. Now we can reduce that a little bit. The reality is, even at 100,000 salary cap, that's a salary cap. It's not that amount for every person. And the vast majority, about 75% of the benefit of this would go to the lower two income quartiles of workers, because the vast majority of people who can't shelter at home and work are low wage service sector workers. So it ends up being a very reasonable cost estimate. And we have worked with Mark Zandi at Moody's, with Eric Beinhocker, who's at the Oxford School, with Josh Bivens at Economic Policy Institute. And the costs are remarkably close in terms of their estimates, about $450 billion for 3 months. But Mark Zandi went one step further, Adam, and he actually estimated what would the savings be. So in other words, if we're doing this program, we're not sending people to unemployment. So unemployment insurance costs that we've already approved in Congress go down. In addition, we're not sending people onto different kinds of health insurance, because remember, when all these people lose their jobs, a vast majority of them are also losing employer-sponsored healthcare. So the estimates are 35 million people are going to lose their healthcare. So rather than doing a COBRA subsidy, which is very expensive, or pushing people onto Medicaid, this would allow employers to keep folks on their employer-covered healthcare. You and I are both big supporters of Medicare for all, but at this moment, I think we should do everything we can to make sure people aren't losing healthcare. So the overall cost that Mark Zandi came up with for 6 months would be $500 billion. Now we already spent, in CARES 1, we spent $349 billion on the Paycheck Protection Program, which, as you said, picks its own winners and losers, allows banks to do it, allows Trump to do it. We just added another $320 billion more to that program. For less than that almost $700 billion that we put into the Paycheck Protection Program, that's reaching a tiny fraction of businesses, we could implement the Paycheck Guarantee Act and cover all businesses and dramatically reduce mass unemployment, keep people on their benefits, keep businesses of all sizes, as well as governments and state localities, nonprofits, from laying off people. So I think it's pretty darn cheap, if you ask me, compared to what we've spent, because it matches the scale of the crisis and it stops the economy from going into a downward spiral free fall.
So how does this work now, though? Given that we have this $500 billion fund for large industry, we have the small business fund, we have the enhanced unemployment compensation. If we were able to make this the next big CARES package, which is what I would love to see, how would this be reconciled with those other programs, with businesses that have already participated in PPP or people who are on the enhanced unemployment compensation who got laid off already? How do we integrate that into what we've done already?
Yeah. So, obviously you and I would have wished that this was the first thing we passed, but at this point, what we believe and what we've written into the policy paper as it stands is that if you got a PPP loan and you want to keep it, you can keep it. That would just continue. My guess is that given the choice, which we would give to people, most people would transition from a PPP loan into this. And there would be a pretty simple calculation to figure out what additional money you would owe or what you would owe back. Most cases, it would be what you would owe, what the government would owe to that individual to transition. Same thing with unemployment insurance. Because this is run through the federal government, my belief and what the economists have told me is keep it simple up front. Deal with the audit function and any changes that need to be made at the back end. So we would provide a 3-month grant to businesses. If we need to make adjustments based on somebody getting unemployment insurance for the first 2 months of that or something like that, we will subtract it out from the back end audit at the Treasury so that we would fix all of the, sort of make sure people aren't dipping into 2 pots, as you might think of. I think the other thing that we want to make sure we do is that we include an automatic trigger point. Now, we have been debating what that trigger point should be, and the latest thinking on that is we would tie it to 2 of 3 economic factors. So the program would renew unless you reach a certain unemployment rate, which is elevated of 5%, and you also meet either a return to a certain level of demand, aggregate demand, or consumer demand. So this would not be something that Congress would have to keep reauthorizing, which I think is very important because this is not a 3-month crisis. This is not even, in my belief, a 6-month crisis. Until we get testing, contact tracing, isolation in place, we are going to see 2nd and 3rd waves of infection, and we're going to need a flexible system so businesses can reopen, close as necessary.
Last question. What does support look like so far in Congress? What are the next steps? What can people do? I know the idea has Republican support as well. Josh Hawley in the Senate has introduced a bill similar, as well as a number of other senators, Bernie Sanders, Mark Warren, and others also very interested in the concept. What are the next steps? How can people help move this idea along?
Yeah, so what we really need is to lift it up in the consciousness of people. And so, if folks that are on the line can really make sure that they're contacting their member of Congress and helping to just talk about why this would help them and the personal stories, I think that would be really useful. We've gotten a lot of support from across the caucus and members are continuing to sign on. I think there's real interest there. We provided our white paper to the Senate, and so Mark Warner, it's an interesting combination of senators across the Democratic spectrum, plus of course Josh Hawley with his own separate proposal. But you've got Mark Warner from Virginia, Doug Jones from Alabama, Blumenthal from Connecticut, and Bernie Sanders from Vermont, all saying this is the way forward. So I think that what we need to do is have people understand the concept and then help us to advocate for this kind of bold relief in the next package. Call your member of Congress, give us stories of how your business or your life would be impacted by this kind of a proposal so that we can just continue to socialize it. It's gotten tremendous support. I don't see real resistance other than the fact that this is a different way of thinking about things. And sometimes, as you know, Chairman Schiff, it's difficult to move the ball down that road, but this one is moving and I feel good about its prospects with the help of people across the country.
Well, Representative Jayapal, so grateful for all you're doing, for your leadership on this and so many progressive causes. So thank you for everything you're doing. We're going to keep fighting and make this happen. And I hope that you will stay healthy, stay well. And once again, all my thanks.
To you as well. Thanks for all your leadership on so many issues and for once again being a champion on these kinds of bold proposals. I so deeply appreciate it.
Thanks. You take care now.
You too.